Hello, my name is Harzing and I'm a professor of international management, staff development lead and research mentor at Middlesex University Business School. This recording is part of a set of 6 which make up the preparation for Middlesex University Writing Bootcamp. Although we're open to papers targeted at any stage of development in the bootcamp and targeted at any journal, we focus in particular on writing for top journals that desk reject a large proportion of their submissions without even sending the paper out for reviews. Our aim is thus to ensure that your paper has the best possible chance of getting into the peer review process. The first session consists of an introduction to the bootcamp and the development of the publishing landscape. In the second session, we then explain how to craft a descriptive and memorable title. In the third session, we explain how to write polished abstracts that include all relevant information and guide the editor towards choosing the best possible reviewers for your paper. The fourth session deals with the introduction of the paper and explains its crucial role in positioning the paper in the scholarly landscape that you're trying to contribute to. Session 5 then deals with the concluding section of your paper and outlines how important it is to end on a high note. We also discuss the strategic role of referencing in this session. In the 6th and final session, we talk about the importance of writing a good letter to the editor, having your paper proofread, and about all the other little things you can do to give your paper the best possible chance of surviving the desk reject process. For those of you who are more visually oriented, here is an overview of the 6 sessions on one slide. So, the second session, day 1, session 2, refining titles. As a general tip, many slides have a URL in the bottom part of the slide that you can look at for further information. This one is a blog post I wrote up for last year's writing bootcamp. The second session is all about titles. First of all, I'll explain why a title has to be both descriptive and memorable and look at the different elements of that. Then I'll give you some examples of what I think are quite useful titles. We then move on to specific tips on how to improve your titles, and we'll look at some title transformations of previous bootcamps. Obviously, a title first of all needs to be descriptive. After reading the title, the reader should have a fairly good idea what the article is about and not be misled in that. This is really crucial when people search for titles as well. Sometimes you want to be a little bit cute in your title and include unusual words, but if these are not the key concepts in your title, you might end up leading people astray. So first of all, a title needs to be descriptive. It needs to include the main concepts and, if at all possible, elements of the research question. If you're doing research in another country and that country is a bit unusual, then it's usually a good idea to include the country in the title. If you use a research method that is quite unusual, I would certainly include it in the title. With all of these, it's usually better to prepare reviewers and readers for this than just spring it as a surprise on them, because they might not appreciate that particular research method, but at least if they know in advance that this is what you're going to use, they can prepare for it. However, I will also say that it sometimes helps to have a slightly unusual title. So you have a slightly unusual main title and a descriptive subtitle. So in fact, you have the best of both worlds, because you attract the attention with the unusual title, and then you have the descriptive title as the subtitle. This is quite common in business and management. It's not so common in some other disciplines. A couple of examples. These are all from one of my most recent PhD students who looked at the role of ethnicity in the relationship between expatriates and local employees that were both of the same ethnicity. So, for instance, American Chinese who were sent out to China. She had main titles like The Benefits of Being Understood, Do I Have to Be One of You, Insider Knowledge or Insider Liability, all playing on this idea that ethnically similar expatriates who grew up in another country might actually be both similar and different from locals in the country they are sent to. As I said before, the appreciation of slightly quirky titles really depends on the discipline. It's quite common in business and management, but it's less common in economics and finance. So for all of these, also again, look at your target journal and see what titles are commonly used there. Here are a few examples of titles that I've used in my own papers. The first one is actually the title of my first ever paper, and the paper was about how everyone in the field had assumed that expatriate failure rates were really high, and when I traced back the literature, it turned out that there was really no foundation for this. So I used the word myth to attract people's attention. Then the second one was an analysis of the detrimental effects of ranking universities and academics. And we try to use a nice alliteration when knowledge wins, and then the sense and nonsense to alert people that this is a nicely provocative paper. Then the third one, a classic, like a slightly provocative, cute first title of Bears, Bumblebees and Spiders, and then a descriptive subtitle, The Role of Expatriates in Controlling Foreign Subsidiaries. And the bears, bumblebees and spiders were metaphors for different ways of controlling foreign subsidiaries. Then the fourth one, that was another play on words, in that we used a main title in different languages, because the article was about the role of language differences and language barriers in the communication between headquarters and subsidiaries. So we thought it would nicely illustrate language barriers. This slightly backfired because one of the reviewers actually said there is a mistake in the title because it's not in English. So this reviewer clearly didn't get the joke. And then this one I already referred to in the previous slides. One of my former PhD students, Shefan, The Benefits of Being Understood. So a slightly metaphorical main title. The Role of Ethnic Identity Confirmation in Knowledge Acquisition by Expatriates. So really descriptive, slightly boring subtitle. This one is the other way around. A main title that really descriptive, really boring. Document categories in the ISI Web of Knowledge. You already fall asleep reading it. But then a provocative subtitle, Misunderstanding the Social Sciences. So in that article, I show that the way that the Web of Knowledge classifies articles really shows that they have no clue how the social sciences operate. This one is about geographical diversity of editorial boards, and it has the main title, Practicing What We Preach. So in our field we preach diversity, but do we also show this in the editorial boards of our journals? Then another article, which was actually an update of my very first article, also on expatriate failure rates. But to attract even more attention, I had a fairly provocative main title, Are Our Referencing Errors in fact undermining our scholarship and credibility as academics? And that certainly drew the attention. Then there's a series of 3 papers that are all about Microsoft Academic, which is a specific data source, just like the Web of Science and Scopus and Google Scholar. I wrote 3 papers on this when it was still very new. So I started out with a paper, A Phoenix Arisen from the Ashes, because it was initially introduced a few years ago, then closed down, and then reintroduced. So a phoenix arisen from the ashes. And then the second one was is the phoenix getting wings? It was okay, this is now starting to develop, and the phoenix is starting to fly. And then the third and last one was when the data source was 1 year old, and I talked about the phoenix being ready to leave the nest as an adult. Then this one, again, about the Web of Science, Thomson Reuters Web of Science, but a specific element of it, the essential science indicators, with again a really provocative main title. Health warning might include multiple personalities. It's actually more puzzling than provocative. It refers to the fact that the Web of Science can't distinguish one Asian scholar from another. So the top ranked scholar in the Web of Science is in fact an amalgamation of about 500 academics with the same name, Yan Wang. And then finally, and this is not an officially published paper, it's simply a white paper on my website, so that's why I had even more freedom in choosing the title, The Mystery of the Phantom Reference, a detective story. So this was about a reference that was repeatedly used in articles, but didn't actually exist at all. So it was just a phantom. And this was a detective story about how we figured out that, first of all, this reference didn't exist, but how it became to be referred. So by referring it this way, a lot of people paid attention and actually started to read the article. The papers that you all bring to the bootcamp will already have a title, but we will show in the live session that is associated with this session, session 2, that nearly every title can be improved. And the way to improve a title is often through discussion with what is more or less a lay audience, because then you can see your title through someone else's eyes. So what we'll do in the live session is to split into groups, maybe 3 to 5 people, and each of them will be led by a bootcamp mentor, and then we'll go through your titles one by one. And we'll show how you can actually sharpen their focus and make them really more attractive to a broader audience. So that's one thing we will do. Another thing that you can do by yourself is once you have what you think is a fairly good title, search for it in Google Scholar. Then if you find that there are loads of titles that look really similar to your title, you might want to think about making it more unique. Obviously, you don't include things that are not in the paper, but there are things you can do to make it stand out a little bit more from other papers. Then the last thing to think about when deciding on a final title for your article is to make sure that it's really information rich. What we often do when we write the first draft of the title, we use way too many words. Examining the relationship between, the effect of, the influence of, towards a framework of, all these fairly empty words that you can find in nearly every article. You can also say between and. For instance, between institutions and cultures, rather than examining the relationships between institutions and cultures. It also suggests a relationship between the two, but is much punchier, much grabbier than examining the relationships between. If you talk about the effect of, the influence of, you need to include in the title what the effect is, what the influence of, because otherwise you're not really saying anything. You're just saying there is an effect, there is an influence. Well, there's pretty much an influence of one variable on another variable, whatever variable you choose. Then what we really often see in titles is towards a framework, towards a theory. towards an analysis. But that really suggests that you're not there yet. So you were working towards something, but you didn't actually achieve it. So again, not a very good way, not a very good way to attract an audience to your paper. So we'll play a little bit with all of your titles, and we hope that for all of you, you'll come away from the bootcamp with a better title than when you started. So I promised I would give you some examples of how we have transformed titles in bootcamps in previous years. There are about a dozen examples of transformations in the full slide deck, but I'm giving two key examples here. This particular one is really typical of the kind of titles that most of us come up with on our first attempt. The professionalization project in HRM, Human Resource Management. A conflict between national institutional influences and organizational institutional motive bases. The author of the title very shrewdly identified afterwards the key problems with this title. There's a lot of really unclear expressions in it. Professionalization project, what's that about? Organizational institutional motive basis. Would everyone who's not exactly aware of the content of the article yet know what this is about? The title is also really long and has a complete overload of nouns. There are so many nouns in this paper, you don't even know where to start. It also sounds quite academic, very passive and distant. And okay, most of our article titles are academic. We're writing for an academic audience, but even an academic audience likes a title that's a bit more attractive, not so passive, not so distant. So the author came up with two new titles in discussion with the colleagues in the bootcamp group. The human resource professional caught between national and institutional dynamics. I quite like this one. Actually, I think I slightly prefer this one to the final one because it's really active. It really gives a kind of an idea of what the key topic of the paper is and how dynamic the paper is, in fact. The latest one, Hidden in Plain Sight, HR's role in workplace conflict as a source of organizational professional power. I suspect he chose this one in the end because it better captures the content of the paper. And the Hidden in Plain Sight is a nice touch, like, okay, it's always been there, but we've never actually identified this. So I think both titles are really attractive and at least induce you to go and read the abstract, if not the entire paper. A second example, which is both similar and different to the previous example. It's similar to the previous example in that this title has way too many nouns as well. It sounds really monotonous and boring, even though it's shorter than the previous title. In fact, having too many nouns in a title is a very, very common mistake. If you don't have any verbs in the title sounds really passive and doesn't have a spark. There are other problems though with this title in that it doesn't really highlight the unique contribution of the paper, which is about city branding. There are loads of papers already about destination branding, so you really need to identify what the unique contribution was, in this case city branding. It also didn't say at all that the paper was about 3 different countries, and the comparative aspect of the paper was actually a key draw card. So the author came up with a new title which started with "What makes a city unique?", which is really engaging the reader to start thinking about the question. which was also the research question of the paper. And then cultural city assets in 3 cultural destinations, descriptive part of the title, which really clearly identified what the key contribution does. So 2 examples that really succeeded in transforming their title in the bootcamp session. We hope that we can transform all of your titles too in the live session. And even if you stick with the same title or nearly the same title, at least you will have road tested your title for comprehension with a lay but supportive audience. Now, if you're someone who prefers to read rather than listen to presentations like this, I've also written up this presentation in 8 blog posts as part of a series. So as you will see from the titles, they basically cover all of the steps that we also cover in this bootcamp. So if you look at the bottom part of this slide, you will see the URL of the first installment of this blog post. I hope the recording of the second session of the bootcamp was useful for you. The next recording will talk about how to polish your abstract.